Da, 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 da. Middle Ages, Renaissance, and the Reformation, 30 years religious wars, absolutist monarchs. Now it's the Enlightenment, long and hard to dare to know. Factories, woods and coal, industrial revolution, cry for freedom, then resounds, Vive la France! Decour and Italy, Garibaldi and the red shirts, Bismarck and Germany, the power behind the throne. Mania starts World War I, Russian Revolution, then there's disillusionment in the world between the wars. Single-party governments, Munich and appeasement, Hitler starts invading, World War II's begun. Cold War tensions escalate, Russia-US conflict, falling of the Berlin Wall, revolt in satellite states. 57 EEC established common market, European unity, now it's modern day.
So after going over the origins and the values, one movement that comes out of the Renaissance is humanism. And so here I have the School of Athens. Humanism is going to be a lot about learning and culture and language. And so a little bit of background about where it came from. Education is going to play a really key role in the thinking of the people during the Renaissance. And how are people going to be learning? It's not necessarily through schools, but definitely through learning language, through a literary and cultural movement. And so humanism comes from the rising interest of humane letters, right? So texts that are about humans, not so much about God. And so in the later Middle Ages, theology, philosophy, and law was kind of where the universities were developing these types of subjects. And in cathedrals, people are writing, and monasteries are writing different types of religious texts. But modern literature is not going to actually form until the 14th and 15th century, where it's considered to be of a modern country. Right, the language is more vernacular than Latin. Okay, so why was humanism actually a movement that came out of the Renaissance? Well, it's because in the Middle Ages it was very much church-centered. So we're going to see there's a shift from a God-centered world to a man-centered world in the Renaissance. So in the Middle Ages, remember, God and the church and Catholicism is kind of what was on people's minds, and it's what they committed their lives to, right? But in the Renaissance, that will change. The writing is going to be different from compared to the Middle Ages. The writing in the Middle Ages focused on politics that could be tied into religion. So the main topic is religion, but it's really the monks and the scribes that were in the clergy that would contribute to actually writing and reading and preserving that type of learning. Whereas in the Renaissance, the subject matter is going to change to political and personal concern. So what's happening in kind of the secular realm of not outside of the church, so not God, where you have basically like lay people, people that are not of the clergy, learn how to write as a profession. And so scholasticism was kind of the last intellectual movement that we talked about. Went from monasticism to scholasticism, now to humanism. Okay, scholasticism, right, was trying to reconcile faith and logic, and so they had a very large approach in terms of philosophy and theology, where humanists really felt that these theological points were very irrelevant. And it doesn't really allow them to understand the world that they live in. Okay, and so humanists want to say, what does the human have to do with their lives in this world? And so very much were they inspired by the classics, right? And I'm going to go over this a lot. I'm going to reinforce this. Okay, the Renaissance, we're always looking to the intellectual life of antiquity, right? The antiques of where the monks, though they are the ones who actually handled, right, these ancient texts of Greek and Latin, and they were, manuscripting, right? They were like transcribing it, copying it by hand. That's where they preserved it, but that's where they're going to take hold and say, you know what, no longer it's just going to be held by the monks, but all of society can learn. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Let's talk about how did humanism impact and influence from that point. In class, we read Pico de la Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, and really just that's what we call the manifesto, right? That's like the document, the writing that we go to, and showing how much is the individual, is man glorified, right? What is man's dignity and role in this world? And just believing that man has no limit, that their development is based upon their own fate, and they decide what they want to do and how they can kind of transform and evolve in that way. Okay, so humanism obviously is going to be about each individual, and there's a concept of the human personality that's to come out, right? There's going to be an emphasis on how each individual is so unique, and each individual is worthy to be looked at and then examined. History is going to be coming out of humanism, right? And how does history come about? Is that they're studying not just like events, but they're looking at the processes of change, and the idea of progress is going to come, and that's what they're going to focus on history. Okay, so like how has progress come from the Middle Ages since that time and coming back? Science is also connected to humanism in the sense where Renaissance thinking, humanist thinking was nothing should be accepted as true unless it is proven so. So that's very much scientific, right, in experimentation. Whereas religion really held to the emphasis of the individual conscience, right? I believe that this is true because it's according to my conscience. Okay. Art is going to be impacted by humanism because the interest of the human body, as the Greeks did with sculpture, right, that's going to replicate too, and the emotions upon a human's face and how the features of human body parts and facial structures and all that kind of stuff comes together in art to be highlighted. In politics, the idea of a sovereign state on its own, as opposed to just being part of Christendom. Right, we talked about how the community of Christendom was what gave the unity throughout Europe, right? That identity throughout Europe. But this is where politics is going to take shape in establishing modern nationalities and saying this is one nation state. They have their own identity in that same way, and politics is going to, from that point, establish itself as like modern politics. Okay, so in order to actually promote a movement of learning, humanists are going to learn Latin. They're going to learn Greek, and even if they only know a little bit, they need to really develop it and be fluent in it. Okay, so they're going to search for a lot of these classical texts in order that they can study them and learn from the Greco-Roman world. Okay, and so this whole cult of antiquity is going to come, and they really felt that they wanted to follow everything that the Greeks did, everything the Romans did. They just glorified it in that sense. And so by the time that the Byzantine Empire is going to fall in 1453, Italy is going to be kind of the center of a lot of the study of Greek, and all of the artifacts are going to be delivered there because a lot of the scholars that were part of the Byzantine Empire are going to run away from the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and so that's where they're going to find the text of Homer and Plato and Aristotle, and they're going to learn them and eventually translate them. Okay, all right. So, who are those that participate in humanism? They're called humanists, and these are the Renaissance intellectuals that are part of the movement. And what do they study? Okay, the education that they receive is what we call humanities, and so humanities is what we just term now as just English and social studies. But essentially, humanities explains many different subjects. Humanities inquires the skills of philology. Okay, so philology is essentially language, okay? The study of language, the structure of language, literature, rhetoric, expression. And so in humanities, we're going to see that there's going to be new educational ideas. So remember, Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, they had theology, they had law, All right, they had philosophy, but now there's going to be the liberal arts introduced. Okay, the liberal arts is going to say literature, math, sciences, and even grammar and history is going to be introduced in liberal arts. Okay, also instead of just studying liberal arts, there's also going to be a lot more professional and technical subjects that can be learned as well. Okay, as far as religious learning, it's not that it went away, it didn't disappear, it wasn't crushed. They and the Renaissance people were not secular. They weren't anti-religious. They were not anti-church. They weren't saying like we get rid of God. They were actually pretty devout still. They were very religious still. The main point is that they are taking a lot of secular learning methods from the Greeks and the Romans, and they're studying now these historical texts to determine, is it accurate, right? Where is it from? Is it corrupted? Is it off? Is it yeah? So how old is it? So they're using these methods that come from the Greeks and Romans, and now they are applying it to what they're learning. So the only secularism is essentially the emphasis of the classical world. As you guys know, before the Greeks, before the Romans and the Greeks, they were very much believing in pagan gods, right? Zeus, Mars, Venus, Hercules, like all of these pagan gods. So this is what we call seculars, because where is the Bible? Where's Christianity? Where's Jesus in there? Not as much, because the emphasis has been shifted to the classical world. As you guys know, okay, the main learning language is Latin. However, over time, you're going to see humanists actually use Italian, right, as their vernacular language, and that's going to be the standard in that sense. And I'll go over Dante, and as an example, French and English are going to be coming after Italian, but Italian is going to be the first vernacular language actually put into learning throughout. Okay. Okay, so let's go into some of these humanist individuals that are really important. I mentioned Petrarch before. He is the father of humanism. He was kind of known as the first modern writer, and he really anticipated a flowering of humanism. He wasn't part of the humanist movement yet, but he's the one who actually introduced it, and he collected manuscripts, right? So he started kind of like the first leg of it, and he discovered, Cicero, who was a great Roman rhetorician who spoke of a lot of eloquence, and Petrarch would learn from that. He would be very eloquent himself and knew how to express himself and speak. He wanted to bring back more of a pure Greek and Latin, not tainted by the Middle Ages. Remember, we saw that the Middle Ages was a very derogatory and dark time. He was very contradictory in the sense where he loved life. He wanted to live it up and travel and fall in love and all these type of things. But at the same time, he would criticize people for doing the same thing. He used language powerfully, right? Language is not just a practical tool, but it was a medium of expression. It was a way to express your moods, to clarify your doubts, and to improve your understanding of the world. And so he would raise a lot of questions of how humans should adjust to the world around them, what is a good life, and how should you live your life. Okay, so one quote is, "Knowledge of self is the first step of understanding others." Okay, it's really deep, right? It's really deep. Knowledge of self is the first step of understanding others. And so in order to understand the world around you, you must learn about yourself first. So you want to celebrate kind of being a human and learning, and use language to describe your expressions and how you feel. Okay, all right, so the trio that comes from Florence, right? We're talking about Florence as the birthplace of the Renaissance. Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio. Dante writes Divine Comedy, and this is significant because it's written in the vernacular. As you can see here to the right, we have Dante holding a copy of Divine Comedy, and it's a metaphoric painting just like his book was, right? So on next to him, he has the entrance to hell, and as you can see all those guys at the bottom left-hand corner, and there's different terraces of the mountain behind him. That's what they call the mountain of purgatory, where you go for a period of time of punishment before you can enter heaven. And then on the right side, you have the city of Florence, and then you have the heavens that are above. And through the Divine Comedy, he's trying to explain what the culture was of the Middle Ages, but he definitely used a lot of influence from the classical texts, and he's from Florence, and one of the significant guys of pre-Renaissance. Okay, all right. So Boccaccio is going to be very close to Petrarch in working together. Also from Florence, working to translate Homer. He wrote the Decameron, and it's really a series of tales. Right, it's a novella to impart wisdom about human character and behavior. Um, it's similar in showing just short stories of what people lived like at that time. His idea and the significance of his story is that these tales represent people in a real setting as individuals. His story is actually about people telling stories to each other. In the time of the plague, of the Black Plague, but I don't want to go into details. The main point is that he's following kind of the pattern of how many people would tell Greek myths of the ancient world, but now in the same way he's doing the same, right? But he's focusing on the individuals and what type of stories that they would tell too. Okay, Bruni as a humanist is really important. Oh, let me back up. Sorry. Okay, so he's a chancellor of Florence. He translated Plato and Aristotle. He's considered to be a very awesome Greek scholar. He would use rhetoric and the art of language in order to influence others. He has a huge emphasis on communication, saying communication is extremely important, and knowledge alone is not enough, right? You actually need to not just obtain facts, but you need to actually use them. This is what I believe, right? You have to actually have an effective use of what you know, and then add using language the power of expression. So you're communicating your knowledge to have some use, to apply it. Okay, contributions. He wrote the first modern history of Florence, and so by establishing like a writing style that's very historical, he can say, you know what, the past is the past, the present is present, and they're separate time periods, but at the same time they're related to each other, and so he's actually writing in a style where there's a division between historical time periods. Okay, a couple more guys. Valla is really cool. He worked for the King of Naples, but he was educated the way that Florentines would. One thing that he's famous for is that the donation of Constantine, right, was actually a forgery. So Constantine, as we remember, right, 330 AD, the Catholic Church said that the donation of Constantine allows popes to have jurisdiction over the political world, but he examined the grammar and language of the donation of Constantine, and he found out that it was written actually 400 years after the death of Constantine. And so popes who did not want to work with kings, they lost all credibility, right? And so kings don't want to listen to the popes even more now. Okay, a quote that comes from Valla is, "Man is born in order to be useful to man." It's very profound, right? And he's really essentially saying that the skills that are used in the public arena that man has acquired, right? These skills, it's a way where they can improve themselves as individuals, right? But more importantly, society around them, right? Man is born in order to be useful to man. So helping one another in the skills that they have acquired. Castiglione, one of my favorite guys, he wrote the Cotier, and it's really it's a etiquette book, right? How should you act properly? It's a manual, and there's certain manners that you should have as a gentleman, and he really directed public life to aspire, right, to live a certain very polite way. The elite, right, if they want to be part of the king's court and they want to be of the upper class, they should be not just born into it, but they should actually be a product of training, should be made that way, not just have a good birth, but also a good training. Okay, so he explains that education is absolutely necessary for these types of people who want to be considered the courtier. So if you want to be that type of characteristics, right, some of the things that you have to understand is Europeans were never this polite of the Western world. We talked about the Western world and how we have certain manners and procedures and culturally Western culture, right? Europeans actually had to be taught by Italians of the Renaissance polite behavior. Before, Europeans would obviously just spit all over the place, right? They'll blow their nose, like, with just their hand. They would just touch things with their fingers, and they don't use utensils, right? And they would be overly emotional in public and stuff. So how do you carry yourself is really important. Okay, so sprezzatura is the Italian phrase for being natural, right? To be nonchalant, to show very little effort in being superior and being cultured and being held up high and accomplished, right? So many people call this like, oh, he has a lot of swag now, right? But I would keep it to, right, he's very natural, he's very at ease and nonchalant with how he carries himself. So what should a person of the courtier look like, right? He should be able to agree with those around him. He should be able to make conversation, be good in sports, in fighting. He should know how to dance. He should be appreciating music. He should know Latin and Greek. He should be well read. He should be educated, right? He should show like some familiarity with learning, but at the same time, don't be like a super nerd too. Okay, you should be graceful. You should be poised. You should be considerate of others as well. And so the idea of the Renaissance man is coming out of this, and that this concept of how to be civilized is coming through these types of works, and it's focusing obviously on the individual. It's focusing on the human, and so the concept of having this universal person that we should all aspire to was going to be developed over time and pursued by many humanists and those that lived in Italy too.